So, Gabrielle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem. I'm not sure if you know this, but in 10 seconds or less, what is it that you do?
Oh, wow. In 10 seconds or less. I help people decide what they really want to do, and then I help them do it. And I also communicate science.
Oh, nice. I like that one. That's different. Yeah. Because a lot of people we get on, like they're in some realm of coaching, and it's the same message, but love that. Love that. How did you get to here? Loaded
Oh,
question. But
that's much longer than 10 seconds, but I'll give you the abbreviated version. Um, so it was really it was sort of a series of happy accidents and following my curiosity. So I actually started college as a music therapy major, and I really loved singing, but I wasn't as passionate about learning every other instrument on the planet. So I pursued my unexpected interest and passion in biology and exercise. And that's how I found out that exercise science is a discipline. And so I switched my major. And in my junior year of undergrad, I really fell in love with anatomy and physiology and realized that I was so fulfilled by tutoring and teaching. And I was invited by my professor to teach the last lecture on renal physiology. So I taught myself the lesson with his help, and I went out and bought like a nice dressy outfit, and I did the guest lecture, and it was like the highlight of my undergraduate years. So I went on to pursue a PhD in skeletal muscle phys and biochem, and I originally intended to study the effects of high fat feeding on muscle growth. But again, a series of unhappy accidents at the time, but turned out in my favor. I lost the tissue samples from that study just due to improper storage. And thankfully, I had in the meantime started up a probiotics study because I wanted to explore the relationship between our gut bugs and our metabolism. And that was really a new sort of area in that lab. That became my main project once I couldn't do my original dissertation. And after I finished up my PhD, I went into a teaching career. So I was in exercise science and teaching sport nutrition. And that's where Mike Israetel found me in a Facebook group from the International Society of Sport Nutrition, recruited me to RP. And a year later, 4 years into my teaching career, I resigned and started coaching full time. I started my own business, and the rest, as they say, is history. I just happened to do a PhD on the gut microbiome way before it was cool to talk about. And then he connected me with Steve Hall from Revive Stronger back in June of 2017. And that was my first podcast. And I've been kind of exploring that area and communicating it since then. I spent about 4 years and some change with RP, and then transitioned to just running my own business full time, and was then invited to work as a researcher at examine.com and some other sort of writing and teaching gigs. So yeah, that's how I got here.
Yeah, fantastic. And when you say coaching, are you predominantly, do you have a multitude of things going on, or is it just like coaching one-to-one clients online with their health and fitness, or yeah?
Yeah, I do a little bit of both. So I have my telehealth business, which is working with clients one-on-one online. So we are working on, I really call it like lifestyle coaching, because it's not just about weight modification. It's not just about nutrition. It's about helping people, as we were chatting before we started, pursue flourishing health. And I also provide education on the myths and truths around gut health, and help people to pursue evidence-based solutions, which are often outside of my scope. So a lot of it is just saying, like, have you visited a gastroenterologist yet? Like, go do that first. And then I work with my good friend and colleague Shannon Beard to do mentoring around our framework of comprehensive coaching and intentional eating.
Brilliant. Yeah. It's funny though, like, is even though we're in I think we're both on very similar lines with lifestyle coaching, but especially in Ireland, it's not like, if I was to say, oh, I offer lifestyle coaching, versus I can get you in incredible shape. People are more intent to go for I want to get in incredible shape. But then once we have a client on board, we do look at all that stuff without communicating too much at the start, because they have to realize it for themselves. And for me, that's a massive win. But I do find it a struggle even just to communicate that in our content, that we look after the bigger picture here. It's not just about what number do I weigh in the scales, how strong I can get. It's so much more than that. So I love that. And like you said, I think you covered the three things there I want to dive into with flourishing health, gut health, the truths, the myths. And the first question I have for you is on what is flourishing health, I suppose. Tell me a bit more about that to kick things off.
Sure. So flourishing health is a concept associated with positive psychology that focuses on people's strengths and inherent capacity to change and grow. And flourishing health is all about prospering across all domains. So we can talk about the physical domain, the psychological domain, the social domain, and the semiotic domain, which is really about finding sort of like the philosophical domain, finding meaning and purpose in life. So if anyone has ever heard of the concept of flow, that was developed by Mike Csikszentmihalyi, I think I'm pronouncing his last name properly, Mike Cheeks. So he talks about sort of the optimal human experience, and that's one aspect that's also related to flourishing health, sort of this idea that when we are engrossed in something that is enjoyable, that is challenging, but we also feel capable of attaining or achieving this thing, and we kind of get out of our heads and detach from our ego and become less attached to our sense of self, that we tend to grow. And after the experience, that's when we become a more authentic, or realize a more authentic version of ourselves. So by focusing on flourishing health, for one thing, as you mentioned, it helps people see that health is about much more than their body weight or their appearance. And it also helps them actually answer that question of what it is they really want to do. And even though it sounds really obvious when I say it, there's more depth to that question, because quite often people are pursuing a certain body size as a means to a more complex end. They want to have, improve their social life or their relationship, or build more confidence and improve their body image. And while changing our appearance can be a form of self-expression and can sort of be a proxy for those things, it really doesn't guarantee deep change. It really doesn't guarantee this optimal experience and flourishing health.
And that doesn't happen with a 6-week program. It doesn't happen with a 30-day boot camp or whatever. And
Sure
I think it's why, but it's why coaching, one-to-one coaching especially, is so important. I like to kind of break it down to help even clients understand things where it's like, we're going to work on the psychology aspect a lot more here than you probably had thought we would. And even though, like you said, flourishing health, physical, philosophical, social, and what was the last one? It was the psychological, I think. Like, imagine trying to work on all those things in a few short weeks. It's not going to happen. So if I was to ask you, how do we change all those things, you could be talking for hours on end, because there's so much things we could go into. But I suppose I wanted to start this podcast by saying that even though I do plan on attending and asking you about gut health next, there is so much more at play that we can't be ignorant to, and we can't, I suppose, expect things just to happen so easy overnight. Behaviors and habit change, and I feel like I'm regurgitating the same stuff in all my last 5 or 6 podcasts, but behavior and habit change takes so long. But at the end of the day, it's the most rewarding thing. It's going to dramatically improve your life. Yeah. So is there anything more you'd like to add on the flourishing health before we dive into gut health? Like, do you have any, I suppose, principles around how do we improve that overall aspect of health?
Well, it's about being cognizant of the relationships between those areas and working hard not to sacrifice one as you're focusing on the other. So, for example, when a person is focusing on their physical appearance. And we have to also be careful not to conflate that with health, because physical appearance isn't necessarily the same thing as health. But if a person were trying to improve their physical health by way of dietary changes, if that prevented them from attending social outings, if it caused a lot of stress and anxiety, then we would be focused on the physical domain, but we would potentially be reducing their experience in the social and psychological domains. So the way that that Flourishing Health informs our practice is that we are ensuring that people are able to provide informed consent for the pursuit of physical changes, that they're aware of what physical changes will provide for them and what it won't provide for them. So there's a lot of transparency in our marketing. Not that we do a lot of that, but I'm not trying to, like, for example, I don't use transformation photos, before and after transformation photos of people's weight loss if that occurs. And I've done that many, many years ago with people who had reduced bloating experiences. But even that I've moved away from, because I don't want to market the idea that a smaller body equates to a happier life. And even when we look at the relationship between weight loss and body image, for example, or quality of life. So individuals who have obesity and who have very low quality of life that they associate with that level of obesity, when they seek treatment, they report significant improvements in quality of life. So in other words, if you are being impaired by your body size, then having a smaller body could improve quality of life. But that's not the case in people who are in large bodies that already have a high quality of life. They are not feeling that same sense of impediment. And so weight loss would not inherently cause an improvement in their quality of life. When we look at the relationship between weight loss and body image will improve in some cases with weight loss, but then when weight is regained, body image goes back to baseline or slightly above. So is it really that body image is improving, or have we just modified our bodies to make them more desirable to ourselves, rather than working on true unconditional acceptance and respect, which is not incongruent with still pursuing health behaviors? So we have this level of transparency and these types of conversations that help people decide what it is they really want. Like, do you want to lose weight and get a six-pack just because having a six-pack is cool? All right. But if you think that it's going to improve, your relationship or garner you more respect, that's probably not the most direct way, or the most the way with the greatest longevity for the type of changes that you want to make. And so in that case, we might focus more on just on the psychological domain, and focus more on body image and more on pursuing enjoyable hobbies and effective communication, rather than a change in physical appearance.
I love that. Yeah, fantastic, because you open that up with don't sacrifice one for the sake of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And like it speaks volumes, because if you can, like you said, if we're focusing more on one realm, it doesn't mean that everything else needs to suffer. And for us, it's really common sense, really, but that needs to get translated into the real world a lot more. And unfortunately, I think there is such a massive dieting culture still out there, and it's made me realize that I probably need to get you back out in the future to talk more about that in depth, because I would love it. I'm going to stick to my guns and go down, the next topic of gut health. So I've been meaning to, as I said, get you on for a while in this, to break this complex topic, as it seems, into something super simple. Mm-hmm. So first question, I know there's no hard answer for this, but I want to hear your definition of gut health.
Yes, absolutely. This is my working definition. It's the 3 Ds of gut health that I developed because I get this question so often. And I realized that, we don't really have a definition for that. Is not a satisfying answer. It's a non-answer. So the 3 Ds that I've developed are diversity, disease, and digestion. And it also, within the definition, highlights the relationship, but the simultaneous separation between the bugs in our gut and our actual gut, our actual gastrointestinal tract. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about the variety and proportions of microbes that live in our gut, and also the diversity of genes. So that's sort of like the recipes available to those microbes. It tells us what those microbes can do. So we look at diversity as the number of different species and their relative proportions and their functionality. And generally speaking, we have sort of a Goldilocks effect of too little or too much diversity could potentially be a bad thing, because it could make for an unstable community or an ecosystem that is very much at risk of collapse or disease. If we have an increase in sort of these potential pathogens for some reason. So we want to have some relative abundance that suppresses the disease-causing aspects of those potential pathogens, and has plenty of the potentially good microbes, the ones that are producing beneficial compounds for us, for example. And that we have plenty of genes and a lot of sort of redundancy, repetition, so that if we lose some bugs, that others can take their place. So that's diversity. And then we have disease. So this is actually looking at the tissues and the functionality of the gastrointestinal tract. So the microbes live in the GI tract, but we don't have any causal relationships established between those bugs and any disease. So there's a separation there. So when we're talking about diseases of the GI tract, we're either looking at functional diseases, so the tissues look normal, but they're not acting in the normal way, or an organic disease where the tissues are actually damaged and there's some change to the functionality. And sometimes we see sort of characteristic differences in various diseases versus healthy controls, but we don't have one characteristic profile of microbes that is just in people with IBD, or just in people in inflammatory bowel disease, or just in people with irritable bowel syndrome, because there's so much inter-individual variability. So from person to person, the unique profiles of microbes are so unique and different that it's very hard for us to identify something that is disease specific. So that's disease. And then digestion. So this is just the subjective experience of digesting food. It can be bowel movements, gas, bloating, feeling full after eating, like uncomfortably full, like delayed gastric emptying stuff going on. And again, the microbes are related to this because the microbes, as they're metabolizing, they're breaking down our dietary carbohydrates that we can't break down, they can produce a lot of gas. And there are certain carbohydrates that lead to a lot of gas production and also attract a lot of water into the gut. And we call those FODMAPs, that's fermentable monosaccharides and polyols. And that can cause some pretty severe GI distress, especially in people with irritable bowel syndrome. So there again, you have a relationship between disease and digestion, but we don't have necessarily causal relationships. It's just, we have associations, correlations, and then in some cases we do have like a causal link between, for example, inflammatory bowel disease. If we have ulcerative colitis, there's going to be ulcers, and that will directly influence digestion.
Yeah, that was one question that popped into my head halfway through there on the disease element, because even for myself, if I rewind probably 10, 11 years at this stage, my diet was terrible. Not that it was overly terrible. It wasn't great, but my problem was I drank a lot of cider throughout college, and I just went off, not that I went off the rails a little bit, but I drank a lot of alcohol, and it severely damaged my gut. I ended up for 6 weeks hospitalized with an ulcer, and it took them, I think, the guts of 3 weeks to find out I actually had an ulcer. I remember being told like the lining of my esophagus was raw, was the words that was used, and that always sticks in my head. Intense heartburn, couldn't eat, lost a lot of weight, just generally felt shit, to be honest, and took me a while to get back to normal functioning levels. Like once we figured out what it was, obviously things were a lot better. They thought there was something wrong with my heart, yada yada yada. But I've still lived with those effects. If I smell cider now, like alcoholic drink cider, if I smell it, I nearly gag, because it turns me. If I don't take a is it a gastro tablet before I go drinking or have a few drinks, I probably would be severely hungover the next day. It's crazy. It was actually my GP that prescribed that to me years ago. I said, look, when you're having a few drinks, take this. I haven't stopped that because it does work. But like for someone like that has had an ulcer in the past, is that a form of disease? Or
yeah, so that would be considered, so it would not be a chronic disease, but there was like an acute disease. So there was an actual injury to your GI tract. So the tissues were damaged, and that can lead to, as you were experiencing, severe pain, difficulty eating, when we're looking at ulcerative colitis, or Crohn's, and the lining of the intestinal tract is ulcerated. Not only does that interfere with food digestion and absorption, but it can also increase the risk of bacteria actually exiting the gut through those ulcers and getting into the bloodstream. And so people are really at risk of very rare blood infections as well. So that's one, it's one really strong example of sort of the way that all of these things are related and the potential role that they can each play, when we're looking at diet and lifestyle and how that can influence digestion, our risk of developing disease, how it influences the diversity of the microbiome. It's just one of those like foundational things that people might overlook, compared to something like taking a supplement. Yes.
And I find even now, as I've gotten older, I'm a bit more adventurous with foods. I'm not as plain as I used to be, and I start to enjoy chilies and jalapenos, that kind of stuff. But there comes a point where I have to pull back on hot foods because I start to get heartburn. I start to feel again, stress is another massive one for me. If I'm stressed, whether I'm aware of that stress or I'm not aware of that stress, I feel like my appetite goes completely. And bowel movements are off, as much as I hate to say it in a podcast, but generally my gut is just like, you just feel bleh. So I do have to be careful. And that's where even I was chatting to a few clients about this podcast episode over the last number of weeks as well. And they have similar questions, and I notice a recurring theme is when clients are stressed, it impacts them so much. And obviously I've learned from that over the years, and I probably have subconscious ways I deal with it and whatnot to make it better. But it leads me into my next point. It's pretty obvious, but why is gut health so important? Why are we even bothering to talk about it in this podcast?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think part of it is that gut health is important in part. I'll tie in a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, when we're talking about diet culture. In part, gut health has become such a hot topic because it is a new way for us to pursue optimal health, which sort of, even as like a global culture, that's something that is highly valued. Optimal health, the pursuit of health. If we have a new environment in which to cultivate health and stage interventions to get healthier, we want to do that. And that to some extent, we are really sold problems that don't actually exist, so that we'll buy the solutions to those. We'll buy the detoxes, the cleanses, and things like that. And we'll start to put the cart before the horse in using things that really aren't substantiated by evidence. We might have something in cell culture, like that looks interesting. And then all of a sudden we've got, 1,000 different collagen supplements and claims that they're going to heal the gut without any actual evidence. So that's sort of my theory behind, part of what has driven this trend. And not that I'm complaining, it's great to have something to talk about, but, just keeping that in mind, that this is a really important aspect of health, but it's not one that we understand very well, and that there are some areas that are a little bit overblown. But when we make changes in the for the purpose of improving our gut health, those changes are often going to improve our whole body health anyway. So if that is a way to encourage people to eat more fruits and vegetables and reduce their alcohol intake and get physically active, then I'm all for it. We don't really know, for example, the direct effects of exercise on the microbiome. We don't know which fiber types each microbe really wants to consume. And we don't know which microbes might be playing a more direct role in health or disease. But we can look at lots and lots of evidence to suggest that a diet with a lot of fruits and vegetables is supportive of health. And it also makes sense that that would be supportive of a diverse microbiome because they are all competing for nutrients, just like living organisms in any ecosystem. So if we're providing them with a wide variety of fruits and veggies and whole grains and nuts and beans, that's good for them and it's good for us. And then the same goes for physical activity and for stress management and for sleep and, reduce alcohol intake and smoking cessation, getting screened for colorectal cancer at the appropriate ages. All of these things are protective for us and happen to also be useful for those microbes. And in turn, those microbes are producing beneficial compounds called postbiotics, like short chain fatty acids that our intestinal cells use for energy. And they're helping to fight off potential disease-causing microbes that we might ingest because we live in a sort of an infested world. And they help to regulate our immune system. And even from birth through life, early on in life, it looks like they probably also help with our overall development, neurological development, immune development. They play a role in skeletal muscle metabolism. So we have sort of this complex and intricate relationship with them. But even if we don't know exactly what these interventions are doing, it's still a good idea to just go ahead and do those because we know what they're doing for the rest of our bodies, the rest of this kind of supraorganism.
Yeah. And if you were to explain that to a child, it's like, oh, fruits and veggies are good for your health. That's probably it. Like, really, if you're explaining to a child, but like, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, isn't it? They benefit pretty much everything by just having a more diverse diet, I suppose. And just to backtrack a little bit as well, if we were explaining a microbe to a child, would I be right in saying it's like they are good workers of the gut, and if we feed them stuff, they mind the gut, and if we don't feed them good stuff, bad guys can get it? Is that too
Yeah,
simplistic?
that would be. No, I usually use the analogy of like a fish tank. If I'm talking to like a kid, and I actually have thought about how it would be kind of fun to like write a children's book to say, I'll go ahead and copyright this. Like, it's my intellectual property. I'm just kidding. But but if I made it like a rhyme, it would be like, hey, you have a zoo inside of you, and here's some things that those microbes do. And so they're living organisms. And we have what we call prokaryotes. So those are very simple single cell organisms that are less complex than the cells that make up our bodies. And they have a little ring of DNA, and that's sort of the genes are the recipes for all the things that microbe can do. And we have more complex ones in there too. We might have some protists, which are, I'm trying to think, like they're parasites, but they're not necessarily going to cause disease. And then we have eukaryotic cells that are like the cells in our body. Like we have fungi, for example, we have yeasts in there as well. So we could really think of this like a fish tank with a bunch of different fish, and all of those fish need food. And so the food that we're providing to them is the food that we eat: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and beans. And if we were to not eat enough of, if we don't feed those fish with enough of that food, then some fish will die. Some fish might eat each other, and we would end up with a pretty sad fish tank. And so it's important to provide a bunch of different foods so that those fish don't have to fight with each other and potentially cause the loss of a bunch of life.
Oh, brilliant. I'm thinking about a fish tank full of dead fish now.
Pretty much.
No, it actually would be a brilliant analogy. I've only started reading books to our 5-month-old. Well, we've been reading books since he was born early, but I could see how you could condense that into 10 to 15 pages. It'd be nice. Yeah, fantastic. I think sometimes when I clarify things on a baby level or a child level, it it just makes it simple to understand what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to feed more good stuff, really. And you said as well, if we don't get enough of that stuff, what impacts that then? What is like, I know for me, it was probably just alcohol and not a good diet and lack of exercise, but what can degrade our gut health? Is that even a good way? Like, can I, based on what I've done, can I get my gut health back to a very good level? I'm not even sure if I can anymore, you know?
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I've asked you multiple questions there. Let's reframe. I'm going to use the black and white term of the word bad. I don't like saying it, but what is bad for our gut?
Yeah. Yeah. So we can kind of look at the behaviors that might increase our risk of disease. And if we look at it in sort of our 3 realms of gut health, right? So we can look at diversity. So what happens if we have a loss of diversity? Well, if we have a loss of the population diversity, so we lose large groups of microbes, it might not do anything, or it might make us more susceptible to increases of those potential pathogens. And they can then start producing what we call virulence factors, or the things that actually make us sick. So for example, C. difficile is a normal inhabitant of the gut and usually is not pathogenic, it's not disease causing. But if we take antibiotics for a very long period of time and knock out many of the other microbes, C. difficile could then increase because there's less competition for the nutrients and real estate. And it can get to levels that actually cause disease. So that could be one potential outcome, that if we lose out, if we're not providing those microbes with adequate nutrition, that many of the beneficial ones might die off, and then we increase risk of either the overgrowth of our own pathogens, or if we were to ingest one, that we wouldn't be able to fight it off. If we look at a loss of functional diversity, say we lose a bunch of microbes and their genes are gone now, we might not be able to produce as many of those beneficial postbiotics that help in some cases to protect us against the development of cancer. So that could increase our risk of colorectal cancer. Then when we look at other lifestyle factors that can increase our risk of disease, things like increased high intake of processed meats and high alcohol intake and smoking. All of those have been associated with increased risk of developing various forms of cancer, but we'll just focus on increased risk of colorectal cancer. And also those are associated with, in some cases, reduced diversity. So not to say that reduced diversity causes cancer, but it's just that those things seem to be correlated. And then if we look at digestion, if we were to eat something that was contaminated with a foodborne illness, and as I mentioned, we weren't able to fight it off, now we could have a bout of serious food poisoning. And what can happen after that is that we develop an acute form of irritable bowel syndrome called post-infectious IBS. So it's like, because we've had this infection and there's been some perturbation to our microbiome and the whole system, now we've developed irritable bowel syndrome because of this foodborne illness. So you can kind of see how all the pieces fit together, but it is still foundational. It's still looking at dietary diversity, physical activity and alcohol intake, smoking, stress, and just general hygiene also. So making sure that we're washing our hands, making sure that when we do take antibiotics, we take them as directed and not just I feel better and I'm going to stop taking them. And then we end up with antimicrobial resistant bugs. That's when we ended up with MRSA and these really serious infections where the bugs have evolved to overcome these antibiotics, and then they pass their genes on. And now we've got a bunch of microbes that are very resistant to most antibiotics. So there are so many levels to this in terms of how we can protect our health and reduce our risk of various diseases.
And on the topic of antibiotics as well, I know it's especially around here, if you go on an antibiotic, the second thing you're going to be told is a pro or prebiotic. And I'm even confused these days, unless I sit down and take up my notes and what I've learned about them over the years and whatnot. But where do pro and prebiotics fit in then? And I have multiple questions on it, but first, where do they fit in terms of an overall diet?
Yeah, so prebiotics are the carbohydrates or substrates, so like an energy source, like a food, a nutrient that is used preferentially by beneficial microbes. So one of those examples would be bifidobacterium. So we don't yet know exactly which prebiotics are preferred by exactly which microbes, but we don't have to supplement with those because we actually get them in our fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes. So we're all set as long as we're eating a very plant-centric, doesn't have to be vegan or vegetarian, but like eating a variety of plants at each meal, then we're ingesting prebiotics. Probiotics are live microorganisms, so live microbes that when ingested in adequate amounts, confer some benefit to the host. That's the current definition. We know that that microbes don't necessarily have to be alive to potentially cause some change or some influence, but the definition of probiotic is that it has to be live microbes that when ingested in adequate amounts, which we don't really know what that is yet, they confer some benefit. So they improve our health in some way. So one example, actually the only example of a probiotic food at the moment is dairy. There's enough evidence to support the statement that dairy contains enough of these probiotic microorganisms and the right kinds that it improves our health. But other foods that are fermented that may also contain microbes either haven't been studied adequately or they have been studied and it doesn't look like they are consistently associated with improvements in health, perhaps because they're not consumed in adequate amounts or they don't have the right type of microbe. We really don't know, we don't know that yet. There's not a consensus statement on that yet. But we can still consume those fermented foods. It looks like there are still some health benefits associated with the consumption of other fermented foods. And it's not going to, hurt. It could make you a little bit gassy if it's some stuff that you're not used to. But that's kind of like where they fit in our diet.
So when you say fermented foods, are we talking about kefir, sauerkraut,
Mm-hmm.
those?
Yep, exactly. Yes. Kefir, sauerkraut, yogurts, sourdough bread. That's a cultured dough. So, and the fermentation process helps to maintain shelf stability, but also can increase the nutrient content of those foods as well, because those microbes are making things for us. And we can also supplement with probiotics. So the probiotic supplementation is probably more effective and more targeted than eating probiotic foods or eating fermented foods. And when we are taking an antibiotic, certain probiotics might reduce the risk of developing diarrhea associated with taking the antibiotic. So that actually is a substantiated evidence-based recommendation, and one that I actually make and one that I use myself as well. So I'll be transparent about my own biases there.
Is there a downside to eating a lot of fermented foods? Is there a downside to me trying to go off now and eat sauerkraut and kefir every day, for example?
Well,
I actually really like sauerkraut, to be honest.
That's great.
Yeah. But then I used to get one that used to be off the shelf in, I think, Tesco's. Mm-hmm. And then I read somewhere, it has to be live or something. And it just confused the hell out of me. And then I just stopped getting it, and that's coming from me as a nutritionist. I'm confused by it. Like, imagine what the general population are thinking behind this stuff, So yes, is there a downside to eating a lot of fermented stuff?
I think that there's also confusion too about what's fermented versus pickled. So pickles could potentially, pickles and sauerkraut can be pickled, so they're put in vinegar, or they could potentially be fermented. So that's when the live microbes are added to the solution. So fermenting cabbage, that actually increases the FODMAP content. It increases mannitol. So if a person has a difficult time sort of processing mannitol, then they could experience bloating, gas, and loose bowel movements if they eat a ton of fermented cabbage. So we look at certain forms of kimchi, sauerkraut, that might lead to some discomfort. But other ferments usually are reducing the FODMAP content of the food. So when we look at things like kefir and many types of yogurt, they're actually going to be lower lactose, so they might be more digestible to people. So in most cases, if we're eating a lot of a fermented food, it's probably just, it's not going to cause any obvious issues outside of like, you know, eating so much of a specific fermented food that you're limiting the overall variety of your diet.
Okay. So I was probably talking about pickled cabbage in Tesco's. Yeah. Okay. Now I feel a bit stupid. So the one I should be looking for is probably the one that's usually in health food stores in the fridge that says,
Sure.
like, are we looking for the words live cultures or live? Like some of them are a bit confusing as well, what they put in the label. And then there's the other question of where do we even start with probiotics? There's so many choices. There's millions of this, there's millions of that. It's like, whoa, where do I even go? Like the last time I got one was for my wife after she gave birth, and I literally just picked the most well-known brand I knew on the shelf, and it was I think the second most expensive one. That's how I picked it out.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I know that it's dizzying because now there are so many, you know, gut friendly or like gut specific ingredients and products. Like, you know, now we've got yogurts and granola, and just like every possible food is, you know, now has like probiotics or prebiotics added. And I guess I should actually clarify. So there's a fermented beverage. So alcohol is a fermented food, and that in excess obviously could be problematic. And so kombucha, a fermented tea, that can cause some GI distress and diarrhea and whatnot. So, you know, maybe limiting those things. But yeah, when we're buying a fermented food, it will say that or a cultured food, it will say that it contains live active cultures, and it'll usually provide you a list of what they added to that food. Now, the issue there is that we don't have the number of microbes present in that food. And even though they were added live to ferment that food, we don't know how many are actually still living at the time of purchase. So that's another reason why fermented foods and microbe-containing foods might not all be considered probiotic, because those microbes also might not be normal residents of the gut. So they could pass through pretty much without, you know, any interaction at all, in one end out the other. They could pass through and have some influence that's abnormal because they're not normal residents of the gut. And the other thing is that we do see that they are present in fecal samples. So when people are eating a lot of yeast-containing foods like bread or drinking beer and things like that, we'll see those counts in their feces. And when those foods are removed, the counts will be much lower or undetectable. So what we're eating is certainly influencing our fecal samples, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is inhabiting the gut long-term. Because in fact, when we reduce those foods in the diet, it's really very quickly that we see that they're no longer present in the stool. So there's even a theory that, for example, yeast species like Candida are not real residents of the gut, but they're in our fecal samples because they live in our mouths and we are swallowing our saliva all the time. So something to keep in mind that, you know, even as we are studying all of this, that we're also realizing now where we're getting things wrong, because we didn't know, for example, that, you know, oh, actually some of these, Saccharomyces species are actually just from things that we ate, and they don't live in the gut. And that's because fecal samples are just a representation of what might be going on in the gut. So just a little take home for people to keep in mind when we're reading research. So the same can really be said for probiotics, that even though we will see increased counts of probiotic microbes in our fecal samples when we're taking the probiotics, there is a chance that they're just going in one end and out the other without causing any changes on the way through, and they may not actually be taking up residence or enriching our native microbiome. We just don't have very much data on that, but we do have some evidence that some people might actually be resistant to enrichment by probiotics. Like their ecosystem is already very stable and robust, and there's like no room left, right? There's no room at the inn. They're just going to pass through and say like, oh, I can't live here, and go on through. That being said, there are probiotics that have been shown in better quality studies sort of over and over again that they help with certain things. One awesome resource that I would recommend for people to check out is AE ProBio. It is a compendium. It's a website put together by researchers and practitioners in the field of probiotics research. And they basically evaluate the evidence and they put together this compendium of probiotics and their application. So that's a place to get started. But just a couple that come up quite often. S. boulardii, which is actually a form of yeast, is apparently very effective for reducing antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And then Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG seems particularly effective for pediatric diarrhea. Now, it's not very effective for adult diarrhea. So that's just one example of the specificity of these probiotic strains, that whatever they are doing in our gut seems to be very strain specific. And so it kind of depends on the backdrop of you, your gender, your location, your age, and your microbiome. That will really determine to some extent what those probiotics do, and then also what you're trying to help with. So if you're trying to reduce symptoms of IBS, for example, you might not have as much luck with S. boulardii as you would with a bifido or lacto strain probiotic.
Interesting. Yeah. So like essentially what I've taken from that as well is if somebody has, we'll call it a pretty good lifestyle, eats a diverse range of food, they're doing pretty well, essentially. And from there, like, is there any, I suppose, principles or practical takeaways that anyone could do after listening to this podcast when it comes to looking after our gut health? Like, is it as simple as eat fruit, eat veggies, eat some beans, don't drink too much?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, starting with the most like reasonable next step for them. So I kind of have established this like hierarchy of influence on the microbiome, and that foundational level really appears to be our long-term dietary habits. So if a person wanted a quick reference to get started, modeling something like the Mediterranean dietary pattern would be helpful, but even just something as basic as aiming for this number that's not entirely arbitrary, but it's based on observational studies of 30 different plants per week. But if you are eating only 5 different plants per week right now, just try to increase that by a couple, like do something that's going to be very reasonable for you. But if you have identified, like, I'm eating fruits, I'm eating vegetables, I'm eating whole grains, but I'm not eating any nuts or beans, maybe just consider adding a couple servings of nuts or beans to your intake, over the course of the week, and then see if you can work up to, getting at least, a serving a day. So just building that foundational dietary pattern that's very diverse. From there, just engaging in regular physical activity. We don't have a direct relationship. We don't know exactly what exercise is doing, but we have a lot of observational correlational data that says people who are engaging in regular physical activity tend to have more diverse microbiomes. So, and they're more diverse in ways that are usually pretty good, like increased bifidobacteria, increased butyrate production. So if you can get up to just the general recommendations of 30 minutes of moderate exercise per day, that's a great start. If you're already doing that, or if you're already training, but it's all just resistance training, maybe consider adding in some moderate intensity aerobic activity. From there, you want to look into the supplementation or more targeted types of foods. Then the fermented dairy would be one to add in as sort of the most evidence-based, the most supporting research for that. And if you want to add some other fermented foods, awesome. And then beyond that, looking at specific supplementation that's not as strong, but potentially omega-3 fatty acids, because a lot of times people are not taking them in adequate amounts through their diet. Maybe they just hate fish. If you like fish, go ahead and eat that. But if not, you can take some fish oil, that might be helpful. And then that targeted use of probiotics as well. But that's assuming that you've got your foundational stuff in place and you're not, your alcohol intake is relatively low, maybe a couple glasses of red wine per week, fitting within that Mediterranean dietary pattern. And those are really the biggest pieces that we know probably have an influence.
Fantastic. Yeah. Like, to me, really, to be honest, it's stuff we should be already doing anyway, when it comes to supplementation, I think the only couple we recommend, your vitamin D3, because Ireland isn't the best for sun year round, pretty much, bar a few months a year, maybe. And like you said, omega-3 fish oils. If somebody's in a fat loss phase, we might look at a basic multivitamin just to cover their bases, because it's such a cost-effective thing anyway. It's like no harm.
Right.
I think it gives people peace of mind. But other than that, like you said, you can look at targeted stuff on a needs be basis. Like, the biggest takeaway I think I have there, or that stood out to me, is 30 different plants per week. For some people, that's like when I hear that, it's kind of like 30. I already started counting it in my head. Like, it gives me a kick to be like, okay, yeah, I need to, at a bare minimum level, change my shop every second week. And I've tried, like, even for somebody who's busy and routines are dialed in, and it's just like, for me right now, the way life is, it's just like, food is like, yes, I'm ticking my boxes and I'm eating healthy and everything that I should be doing. But when you're busy, it becomes nearly more of a convenience for me. So like, I'll eat the same lunch for the last 4 or 5 years, which is fine. But where I get my diversity then is like maybe it's realistically in 2 meals a day. So if I don't shop differently each week, it's the same thing every week. And then I'm limiting myself then and limiting for my partner what we're actually consuming. It might be only, I don't know, 10, 12 plant-based stuff a week, or versus you were saying there, if it is only 5, we can work from that. But if we are looking for that 25 to 30 target, for me, it gives me a kick. But for somebody else listening, it might be very, very scary to think about that. And it's like, oh, no, that's not me. But assess where you're at and what is the next step for you, like you said. And just to define it as well, when you say 30 different plants per week, you don't just mean, spinach and broccoli and only leafy things. You mean beans, fruit, whole grains, yeah?
No, I mean, it's just literally 30 different plants. So it could be, like 3 different types of green vegetables. So like broccoli, cucumber, lettuces, and again, like you pointed out, it can be very daunting for people. And that's why I'm very hesitant to use that number, because it's very high and it might not be super realistic. And I want to be very cognizant of real life, right? Like what people actually have access to, what's realistic for them. And I'm like not the proponent of the, this quick recipe uses everything that you already have at home. Start by milking your Tanzanian goat. Like, people don't have all this stuff already at home. You don't have 5 different like goji berries and acai and chia seeds and whatever else. So like, looking at what is really feasible for people and the most frictionless ways to increase dietary diversity, being like stopping the whole fear mongering about like canned foods and frozen foods, that if canned foods are the way for you to obtain your vegetables, that's awesome. Maybe opt for the low sodium varieties if you can. If not, rinse them really well. So that's one way to do it. Or using frozen. I am super busy, and like during the day, also as a side note, thinking about like obstacles to people just like eating, solid meals multiple times a day, or cooking and things like that, using microwave frozen veggie mixes, or blending frozen fruit mixes, or buying the fresh stuff because it can be sometimes cheaper to do that, and then freezing it so it stays good longer term. So using these more shelf stable options and making it more tangible, like more like just easier, not that you have to cook a fresh meal every single night and, have all of your 30 different plants in that meal. But if it makes sense for you to have like a frozen blend of peppers and onions, awesome, use that. Like I'm not like the health halo type of person. I'm just here to like help people find ways to eat a few more vegetables and, switch to whole grains, or, adding in some mixed nuts. So like if you can find a mixed blend of whatever plants you want to use, that's a great way to go about, increasing that diversity without having to buy, like a different set of foods each week.
No, but apologies. I took it wrong on the 30 different ones at the start. I was
Yeah,
thinking there's
no.
another thing I've heard in the past. But again, it comes back to the basics of exploring different things as well. Like you said, like frozen foods is something that I probably need to do a bit more of to make life easier for myself. But we're in a habit now of just I went through a phase of being so convenient that I really like cooking at least one meal a day now, which is like your dinner meal. It's nice, but again, you have to adapt that to your life. Just because things are busy right now and you need to adapt for that busyness, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. Just because you're prepping food for a day in advance is not a bad thing. Because I know some people have very strong views on that, because like some people have grown up in home cooked meals all their life and they find it very hard to come away from that. But again, like, you have to adapt to suit you, that just benefits you for that given point in time. And it's really not rocket science when we break it down. Try something new each week. Try something new for one dinner a week this week. There you go. You've already broke the seal of trying new options. Fantastic. And I think from that as well, we know that we don't have to, I put the term eat clean on it. We don't need to eat clean 24/7 to be quote unquote healthy or to achieve a body composition result. But I know it's a very open-ended question, but how much is too much flexibility? How much processed food can we, like, is there a limit, or is it something as simple as, if I have 1 bar of chocolate and a bit of popcorn, I'm fine, but if I have 2 bars of chocolate, I feel like shit? Like, is it as simple as that, or do you have recommendations for where do we draw the line with food flexibility across a week?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think it kind of depends on the qualifier of like too much for what or for whom, right? Because when we're thinking about dietary patterns, dietary patterns are intended to reach different goals. So we might have a dietary pattern for general health and well-being, and we may have a dietary pattern for a physique competition. The level of flexibility in either one of those is going to be extremely different, as is the level of sustainability and the level of risk. So a person who is eating a very strict, even if it's flexible, it's going to be relatively more strict than something for Gen Pop. A person on their way to the stage is going to be at greater risk of developing an eating pathology, obviously at great risk of developing nutrient deficiency, hormonal issues, and objectively reducing their physical and psychological and maybe even social health on the way to the stage. Like, objectively speaking, those people on stage are not at their healthiest in any way. They're just at their leanest and most muscular appearance. Whereas a person who is eating to support their health and well-being and longevity may be, they're not necessarily counting anything. They're probably going to be eating a wider variety of foods, more hyperpalatable, energy-dense foods, and they're not doing as much as they can to manage their hunger levels and eat high-volume foods all the time, because they're probably, if they're in a balanced, adaptive relationship with food, eating when they're hungry until they feel satisfied and then moving on. And, when you look at those people and they're engaging in physical activity and things like that, whether they're eating a Snickers bar every day, in all likelihood, looking at those objective measures of health in terms of physical, psychological, social, that comparing those two, I think it's probably not outlandish to say that the person eating for health and well-being and longevity will be in a healthier state on the spectrum than the person who's on stage. Even though we might look at the Gen Pop person and say, I don't know, maybe they exercise, they look like a normal person, and then we look at the person on stage and we're like, oh my gosh, that's the pinnacle of fitness and health and aesthetics. But it's because we judge based on external appearances. So the level of dietary flexibility that's appropriate for a person is the one that allows them to meet their nutrient and energy needs, that allows them to still maintain all aspects of flourishing health because they're still able to socialize, they're supporting their physical health, they aren't stressed about food, and they're not like deriving their meaning and purpose from the way that they look or their identity from their specific diet. Food is nourishing them, it's an enjoyable experience, it's satisfying, and it's going to be whatever dietary pattern is suitable for that person in that specific lifestyle.
I think you nailed it when you said to meet their nutrient goals, essentially, because once we're doing that, it's an individual thing, really, isn't it? Yeah. Like even if I look at, I'll use my own journey as an example. If I rewind 15 years ago, I didn't have a great relationship with food. I went through that whole paleo thing, tried keto. Like, believe me, I've tried a lot. And above all, food consumed every part of me. It consumed my thoughts every fucking day. And obviously, once I got educated and became a nutritionist, and I've been helping people for the past 8 years in that, I'm at a stage now where, like, I don't crave foods. I love chocolate. I don't have a sweet tooth. You know, I'm not telling I like chocolate. Like, it's not a big deal. And I have it. Yeah, pretty much have it most days of the week if I want it. But like, it's a choice. You know, I don't feel the need to have it. I don't feel the need to break out a pizza every night. I don't feel the need to have a takeaway every night. I had a takeaway last weekend and I felt terrible after it. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to get that for a while again. You know, so even now, if I am having a meal out or a takeaway, I'm very selective with what I choose. You know, I just don't go for the mindless thing of a big, we call them a big dirty Chinese here in Ireland. When they say that, it's like just it's covered in oil and you know, it's a very high calorific meal. Same goes for like, a big dirty pizza. You know, a super high calorie meal, doused in oil, et cetera. But that to me just doesn't, it leaves my gut feeling all over the shop. So I'm not even, you know, I don't really enjoy it as much as I used to, because it's nearly a cultural thing. Like, you know, we must have takeaway, we must eat this. You know, it's funny that the level you can get to over time. And it's something that we try to instill in clients, that, like, yes, while we can be flexible, it is a choice at the end of the day. And I think that's super empowering, you know. And funnily enough, once you know you have control over that and you have a choice, what gets improved? Your gut health. What gets improved from the knock on of that? And pretty much everything. So I think it's a nice point to finish on. And if there's anything more you want to touch on in that realm of the food flexibility spectrum, let me know. But if not, what is the best place people can find out more about you? Is it Instagram?
Yes, absolutely. And I think just emphasizing the point too that you made about what feels good in eating. And it's not just what tastes good. It's not trying to meet an emotional need. Yeah. It's, you know, what foods do I find that digest comfortably? Like those signals from our gut can be a very important source of information to guide our eating. We don't necessarily have to count macros. We don't have to label food as good or bad. We might just say, hey, like, this food doesn't suit me very well. If anyone has ever heard of Dean Karnazes, he's an ultra marathoner. So this man will run 100 miles in one day. While he's running, he has been known to roll up a pizza and eat it like a burrito. He calls it a pizzarito. So Dean Karnazes is sort of superhuman, you know, and he can run. He metabolizes lactate like as fast as he produces it. So he can run pretty much an indefinite 7-minute mile. So I think we could look at that and say, like, in that case, Dean Karnazes has been able to train his GI tract to handle eating an entire pizza while he's almost sprinting, you know? So, wow, that's amazing. And, you know, and it just goes to show, like, pizza is not inherently a good or bad food. It can be a very useful food for someone who's, you know, using 3,000 calories an hour. But it took him time to, like, be able to comfortably digest that food. And for most of us, if we listen to those internal cues and notice how hungry or how full we are and how food feels once we've digested it, then we can determine the amount that works for us. You know, it could be like, yeah, 2 Reese's cups is too much before a workout, but I like to sometimes eat 1 Reese's cup before a workout. If it tastes good, digest comfortably, it works for me. And I don't need macros or anything to tell me to not eat too. It's just like you said, it's a decision, it's a choice I've made. So it's another thing that I really help to, that I try to help people establish in having a more internally regulated relationship with food. So if people want to learn more about that, they can go to vitaminphdnutrition.com or check me out on Instagram at vitaminphd. That is the source where I post like lots of free content about gut health, comprehensive coaching, and intentional eating. And then Shannon and I run another website called btgcomprehensivecoaching.com. And that's where we post all things comprehensive coaching and sort of looking at like the history of dieting and diet culture and sort of the sociocultural aspects of the industry.
Nice. I will link up all those in the show notes anyway, so I will be sure to cover all them. And if there's anything else you want to send on afterwards, you can pop that over. It's just a website, I think, is one thing we mentioned. Is it I tried to write it down here. Was it the AE ProBio website?
Yes. Yep. AE ProBio. Yes.
AE ProBio.
That is the probiotics.
Yes. Perfect. Yeah. I just want to make sure I have that linked up as well. But yes, fantastic. Gabrielle, thank you very much for coming on. I've been meaning to get this done for a while. Delighted with that, and I hope there's a lot of takeaways for those listening in, because I have it's given me a kick, to be brutally honest, to be more diverse with my food, and I'm excited to go away and do a shop now. Believe it or not.
That's awesome. That always is a good feeling. Yeah, when it's like good to try new stuff. Great.
Yeah. And I think as a coach, so like I know how important this stuff is, and I think when we spend an entire episode talking about this one singular topic, it just goes to show that like how important it is for pretty much everyone. So if there's one or two things you can apply, guys, from this episode, I'd love to hear it. And Gabrielle, thank you again for coming on. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
No problem.